Hello and welcome back to the worst Warmachine channel on the internet. I'm Malorian, and it's time for another bonus Warmachine Weekly. Now, this bonus one is coming to you from Darrell Duncan, one of my content overlords. And what Darrell Duncan wanted me to talk about was an interesting one that's going to make some people mad. And what it really is, would we be better off right now having Mark II rules? Now, this is not talking about the model rules. This is talking about, like, you take the book and it says this is Mark II and this is what we're going to be playing with. Now, I say that this is going to be making a lot of people mad because there's a lot of people out there that are like, yeah, the reason I left the game is because Mark II was so much better than Mark III. They changed all these rules. They made it so stupid, and it should just go back to the way it is. And spoiler alert, I'm going to cover a lot of these changes that I wrote down here. They're all the significant ones, and I don't think that they're right, but we're going to go through these. Again, each one of these could have been like a full video on themselves, but we're going to kind of quickly go through all these here. I have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9. I got like 10 on here. So like I said, I don't want to be doing like an hour-long video. So let's just jump into it, and maybe we'll leave some of the more spicy ones to the end. So the first one I want to be talking about here that maybe some people forget was a thing back in Mark II, and that was our throw parties. Now, what this really was is that if you throw something, it can still attack. And so something you could actually do for extra threat on your models was to throw them towards you. In fact, that was actually a big thing that the minions were known for, because those wrestlers would just be like, I throw you over there, and then I throw you over there. Hell, maybe I even hit your caster and knock them down, and then I'm right there to go and kill them. And it was kind of ridiculous, right? This idea where, okay, literally nothing I have can get to you and kill you, but if I throw one of my things at you, I got you. Now, it was nice for the silliness, but it really wasn't a good rule. Also remember that throws were different back then, so they pretty much like always scattered type thing, unless you could like aim at something and like hit it and knock it down type thing. Otherwise it was always scattering. And so yeah, it's not like the laser throws we had now. And so it's just like, hopefully like from downtown I'm going to throw this heavy and it's going to get to you. It was just silly. It was ridiculous. And again, some of these arguments will be about whether maybe you do want a silly game, but if you want a Warmachine that has like tight rules, this is probably not something you want to have in there. And like there were things where like you had like AD models and you could actually like set up a thing where like if you go first, you're attacking them on their deployment line. It was really, really silly how you could like get all these throws together. So there's the first one, not a good idea. And while we're talking about that, let's talk about some of the other power attacks we lost through this, and that was push and weapon lock. Now, push I kind of miss. What you would do with push is you would push. One of your heavies could do a power attack and move something else 1 inch. And remember, in this, you could be attacking your own stuff. We're actually going to be talking about that next, but let's just remember this. So if you are wanting to get extra threat, and you know how important right now getting that threat range is, imagine that like every single battle group model they had was basically another threat extender. You know, like this model comes up, pushes it up, another one comes here, pushes it up, and it's like, oh, geez, I guess this thing like now threats an extra 2 inches. Now, I liked it for scenario stuff. So if somebody put like a foot in terrain, like boop, you'd push it back out. But yeah, like that's not something that was probably really needed for the game. And worse yet, it did things for like synergy, where again, we don't want to get kind of like into those rules because those are model rules, but the idea that we're ramping up this synergy crazy with this like pushing was kind of ridiculous. The other one was weapon lock. Now, weapon lock, there's a famous example where Jay Larson, won a tournament with weapon lock, and so that was a big deal, but otherwise it was never used. So weapon lock was basically like a power attack you would do against the target's, like one of their weapons. And then you would go and like grab that weapon, and then they wouldn't be able to use that arm or head or whatever until they actually go and break that hold. So you'd have to like break the hold first, or just like hit them with the other arm. Again, it was like an interesting rule, and sure, but nobody used it. It was just text that was in there. Usually when people tried to do it, they did it wrong. It was not worth being in the book. Now, I told you the next thing we're going to be talking about was attacking your own models. Now, you do attack your own models now, but back then you could be doing charges against your own models, and you could be doing power attacks to your own models. And if you can imagine, again, all these silly throws were like, hey, you're a weapon now. And I'm just going to throw you over there and try and knock things down. Or, you know, like the other thing is too, is like, oh, my caster needs to get closer to you. So I'm going to run one of my models so I can charge my own model. And just like, even though, again, I like the idea of the tactical aspect of this, of like, okay, I'm using a resource to get an advantage, it just really kind of pushed those threats too far, right? The idea that I can, you know, if I want to shoot you with Kane too, I can charge one of my own models to shoot farther seemed a little bit silly. So by taking that away, and again, like throwing your own models and stuff like that, it just kind of like takes some of those extreme threats and keeps them under control, right? We want to kind of get away from the idea that the game is a bunch of bazookas and who's going to shoot it first. So that's another one where I think it's good that they kind of took that one away. All right, the next one that I want to be talking about here while we're talking about like power attacks and stuff like that is going to be knocking down in water. So this used to be a big deal. So what it used to be is that if you got knocked down as a jack in water, then basically like your cortex goes out, your engine goes out, and something like you're inert and something has to come back and reactivate you. So think of juniors now. Now, of course, back then juniors, there weren't that many, but now we're more used to like, okay, you kill the junior and then the jack goes inert. Well, think how much easier that is when you just have to knock them down in water. So maybe you're throwing them into water, maybe they're already in water and you just headbutt them, or maybe you're Barnabas and you put water behind them and slam them into it, you know, like stuff like that. So like jacks, like, oh my God, if you're on a board that has water, and especially if they can make water, it was really dangerous. Jacks were really in trouble, and it wasn't really a good place for jacks. And while we're talking about that, let's also talk about the idea that there was no power up. I think people have really gotten too used to the idea that all your jacks get a free focus. Imagine what happens when you don't have that. On turn 1, where you want your battle group to run up, that means that's focus that you have to allocate, and then you can't be putting out your upkeeps. And so you really had to make a choice about whether your battle group was going to be falling behind or what upkeep am I not going to be putting out. And what it really meant is that you didn't really take a lot of jacks, and that's why you had a lot of infantry machine back in Mark III. And between these two rules, that's also why beasts were just better than warjacks. If you go out there, this is a hot topic by itself, and to me, it was really obvious that, especially in Mark II, wow, beasts were just so much better than warjacks, because, I mean, there's still things that, like, you can cripple weapons and stuff. It's not as easy as a warlock being like, oh, you're fixed. Like, you're in a lot of trouble. And then, like, if you're thrown into water, you're not getting free focus. It was just, it was not a good time, and kind of really skewed the game towards, like, this infantry machine, which isn't necessarily bad, but when you want to build this game on the warjacks doing things, well, then you need to have a way to empower warjacks to do things, and not just be like, oops, I fell down into water and I can't do things anymore. So, yeah, that was something else as well. All right, talking about not doing things, let's now talk about the fact that you can't shake blind. So again, people are used to the idea now that are like, oh, if I get the blind effect on me, one focus, one fury, it means nothing. Back then, no, this was horrendous. And I mean, like, I'm sure there's even a lot of people now that don't even know what blind does. So what blind does is that, first of all, you have to forfeit your movement or your your action, and that already is bad. And then on top of that, you get like minus defense, and you get minus mat, and I think you can't even shoot. Like, it is really, really bad, but it doesn't matter right now because you just shake it. When you can't shake it, oh boy, that's why you saw Gorman all over the place, just going like, boom, blind, and like, if you caught like multiple battle group models with this, they were doing nothing, you know, like it was just so deadly on whatever you could get it on there. And so of course Gorman was the most common one that could be all over the place, and it just really again made you not want to go with like Jax and these elite things because they could just be blinded and then they didn't do anything, right? You need more stuff that could space out and stuff like that. And I think the game is better now where you're not just seeing Gorman in every single list, and that, I mean, blind is still something that takes a resource, but it's not something like, well, I landed this Gorman shot, so I basically just win the game. So I think that's another good change there as well. Now, the next one I want to be talking about is hills. Now, recently I talked about hills, and, you know, this could almost be like a Mark III thing because, you know, the hill change happened in Mark III, but I want to kind of like take a little like side tangent here to talk about scenario stuff and the fact that we had these hills, and it really made things really weird. And I'm going to mix this one on with like some other terrain stuff. And I wanted to remind you here that in order to score, like not to score, in order to get the benefit from hills or forests or something, you didn't need to be completely in. You needed to put a toe on it. So if you were touching terrain, you got the benefit from it. So you saw all these silly things of like infantry running, like hoof it, put a toe in the trees for the other person's turn so you had concealment, and then hoof it again. Same thing for like the hills. Put one toe on the hill, and then off we go. And it just got ridiculous for things where like, you know, because it's not like completely in. It's hard to say sometimes, right? Like, okay, did the table get bumped? Was it supposed to be touching? Wait a second. Does this count as touching, or does that count as touching, right? And I just hated those rules. And I mean, like the hills themselves, the whole idea of like, you know, the extra elevation and like what can you combine, the concealment and cover and elevation and stuff like that. It was just, it didn't make a lot of sense, right? Like it didn't make a lot of sense of why you would be getting all these bonuses by putting a toe in. It didn't make sense that cover and concealment didn't stack, but cover and elevation would stack. Like the line of sight things were a little bit weird as well, where like if you're just a colossal and you go and step like one toe on the hill, you see the world, right? And it's just like, it was just so weird. So I'm kind of glad that they fixed not so much hills, but I'm using hills of like the excuse of talking about all scenario pieces for terrain, and I'm really happy that they made all those changes to it. Now, when we're talking about scenario, let's talk about some other things that are in there too. Now, part of this is me going to be something that I actually miss, but this is going to be the first of 5 or maybe even 3, because back then sometimes you just needed 3 points to win, and boy, that was pretty easy to do. So scenario was very live and all the time. So again, right now you need like 5 more points. So every single time your opponent scores, it's almost like you're losing a point if you're trying to win by scenario. But before, it was just first to 5. So I'd be in cases where like, I don't care if you score, I just need to make sure if I score. And that's why it was like the game of jam, get in there and do this stuff, right? Especially when you need like 3 points. Wow. That was like jam in, get a point, get 2 more. Thank you. Goodbye. I take the win. And as much as I was good at that like type of scenario and I won a lot using it, I have to admit that the game is probably better when you need to roll dice. I have locals that hate the fact that I was winning games without rolling dice. That seems like you're kind of breaking the game. And so as much as I am sad that my way of playing with like a bajillion Buccaneers doesn't work anymore, or it's harder to work as well, the game's in a better spot for it. And I mean, like something in here as well is, if you remember, we used to have dominate. Now what dominate meant is that if you scored something with your caster, you didn't get 1 point, you got 2 points. So again, when you're trying to like be first to one of these things, it was almost one less, because when you're trying to score those points on that last turn, you could run your caster into one, and it's not just scoring it once, it's basically double scoring it. So if I was ever up in by 1 and then I needed a 2 to win by 3, okay, clear one flag, run over the caster, or again, throw in the caster or something, and boom, I score my 2 points. So like, it was pretty easy to arrange these things. And like sometimes, like what I said with those throw, where like things are like scattering and stuff, it's like, okay, let's find out. If it scatters on the flag, I win. If it scatters off the flag, I lose, right? And it was kind of ridiculous. Talking about that scenario stuff as well, we had stuff too where like you had to have at least like 50% of the unit. So if they kill off like a little bit more of the unit, you had to have what? If half of it was... Yeah, if more than half of it was still alive, if half or more was still alive, you could score it. So anyway, people would be like trying like go and kill off just enough so it doesn't score anymore. Again, it's weird, right? Like, why can't 4 infantry score this, but, 4 out of 10, but if I have 2 eliminators, they can do it? How's this making any sense? So it's like some of those rules, I'm glad they cleaned all that stuff up. All right. And now the last one I want to talk about, and one of the ones that, Darrell really wanted me to talk about here, is pre-measuring. So again, a lot of us right now are used to the idea of measuring whatever you want. If it's on the table, pull out your tape measure, pull out your X-Acto sticks, whatever you want, measure anything you want. You could not do that in Mark II. This is what you could measure. You could measure your control range. And so specifically, just like from your caster out, if you did it from your caster out and were like, you were cheating. You could like measure your control range for the unit. So from like the unit leader. And then you could do things like if things are contesting or not. So like if it's around a flag or around an objective, you could be measuring that. And then otherwise, you're trying to like brain math all these things to kind of remember where these things are at. I remember trying to play against my opponents and them like every time they moved up, okay, we started this far apart. Now they moved this far up. Because when you can't pre-measure, wow, you'd start like doing things like just you would miss shots, not because they had stealth, but because, oh, I have a 14-inch range gun, and it turns out you're 14.1 out. And it's like, oh, I guess this really important shot's not doing it anymore. Or if I'm trying to charge you, it's like, oh, it turns out you're out of charge range. I guess I fail. Now, there's people out there that believe that that was better for the game because, oh boy, who knows what's going to happen. But I got to tell you, it was awful. It was awful because the people that were good at like doing the math and being able to gauge things themselves were better at the game. And I don't think that's a skill that should be necessarily part of this game, right? If we were to go to this and be like, okay, what's really important to win this game? You have to have graphs of strategy. You have to be able to foresee what your opponent's going to do. You're trying to build the right list to deal with the meta. You're trying to do this, you're trying to do that. But if something comes up of like, okay, there's dice math, but it's like, you have to be good at trig. You have to be good at counting and estimation on the board. Like, there's a point there where like, that's probably not what we want to be having part of the game here. And wow, the number of times, like sometimes now you have to call over a judge. We're like, is this just in? Is this just out? That happens sometimes now. In Mark II, it happened all the time. Because you'd be like, okay, I move this one up to try and shoot. I'm pretty good at gauging, so it's here. Shit, it's really close. And remember, back then, we didn't have a lot of like these X-Acto sticks. So you're trying to use some of these measuring tapes where some were better than others. And to be like, okay, call over the judge. Okay, this one's in. Okay, that's great. Let's move over to my next hunter. Okay, it's really close again, judge. And it's just like these judge distance calls were happening all the time. And sometimes it would really depend or determine who won the game or not. Because like I have a very important shot or mainly charge. And if this doesn't happen, wow, the game's going to completely swing the other way. And so it was just silly that this type of a thing would have such a big impact. It slowed the games down so much. It gave such an advantage to the people that were good at those estimations and counting up distance in their heads. And at the end of the day, it would be like, okay, I completely outplayed you. I got to this one point, but it turns out this charge I had just failed. And so now instead of getting in there and getting the alpha and taking out your heavy, now you took out my heavy that I did all this work to set up for, and now I've lost the game. And I don't feel like, again, that's something that should be determining who wins the game. You know, that we might as well just be having like random charges. Why not, right? Your charge is 2d6 plus 1 or something stupid like that. Like, no, that's not what we're playing this game for. Warmachine, like there's other games you can go play and be silly. Warmachine is supposed to be a clean rule set. And having these little random things that just like determine the game was not good for the game, in my opinion. So there you go. There's everything that was, I mean, like there's other things in Mark II, but to me, these were the larger things that I feel people are forgetting when they're like, oh, back in the glory days of Mark II, was it really the glory days? I think there was a lot more problems. And I think when you look at all these things, like Mark III is a really good rule set. There's some other things that I feel like they could be changing to be making even better, but honestly, we're in a really good spot right now. So for any of those out there, they're like, oh, Grumble, I don't play the game because Mark II were better. I think you're just wrong. I think you're absolutely wrong, and you need to come here and actually play this game before you go and poo-poo it. So there you go. Thanks again to our content overlord, Darrell Duncan, for this topic. Again, I'm sure a lot of you are going to be having opinions on it, so whether you think I'm right, you have other ideas, you want to call me an idiot, all those things are fine. Put it down in the comments, and otherwise, we'll catch you later. Bye.